There's a moment after deep interchange that feels more unsettling than crisis, more confusing than loss, and harder to explain than pain. It is not despair. It is not emptiness in the dramatic sense. It is not hopelessness. It is the absence of a question that once organized your life. You notice that you are no longer asking what everything means, not because you found an answer, not because you solved anything, but because the question itself no longer arises. You wake up and move through the day without orienting yourself around purpose. You make decisions without referencing a larger narrative. You act without checking whether something feels meaningful enough. And when you notice this, a quiet fear appears. Is something missing? Shouldn't I be searching for meaning? Have I lost something essential? This fear does not come from suffering. It comes from contrast. Because for a long time, meaning was not optional. Meaning was how you made sense of pain, how you justified effort, how you endured uncertainty. Meaning gave structure to difficulty. It told you why you were doing what you were doing. And now that structure is gone. Not violently, silently. You are still functioning, still engaging with life, still capable of joy, interest, and connection. But the pressure to locate meaning has disappeared. And without that pressure, something feels off. Because we are taught that a meaningful life is a good life, that without meaning, life collapses into nihilism. So when meaning fades, the mind panics, not because life feels empty, but because it feels unanchored. This is the stage almost no one talks about. The stage after motivation collapses. The stage where action no longer requires pressure. The stage where you stop asking, why am I doing this? And that absence feels dangerous, because for most of your life, meaning was not a philosophical luxury. It was psychological glue. It held identity together. It explained suffering. It gave you a sense of direction when nothing else was clear. So when meaning-seeking fades, the psyche reacts as a support beam has been removed, even if nothing actually falls apart. This is why the experience is so confusing. You are not unhappy, but you are uneasy. You are not lost, but you are disoriented. You may notice thoughts like, am I becoming indifferent? Is this apathy? Why don't I care the way I used to? But these thoughts don't quite land, because indifference feels cold, and this does not feel cold. It feels neutral, almost peaceful, and peace can be frightening when you are accustomed to striving, especially striving for meaning, because striving gives you something to hold on to. It gives you tension. And tension feels like life. Without tension, things feel flat. And flatness is easily mistaken for emptiness. But flatness is not emptiness. It is the absence of dramatic contrast. And dramatic contrast is what meaning thrives on. Meaning requires opposites. Purpose versus futility. Growth versus stagnation. Becoming versus failing. When those opposites soften, meaning loses its grip. This does not mean life loses value. It means value is no longer conceptual. And conceptual value is what meaning provides. So when meaning fades, the mind assumes value has faded with it. But that assumption is not accurate. It is habitual. Carl Jung understood the stage well. He observed that in earlier phases of development, meaning is often something the ego constructs to orient itself. Meaning helps the ego endure difficulty. It answers the question, why should I keep going? But the need for that question diminishes as the psyche reorganizes, not because life becomes easy, but because life becomes lived rather than interpreted. This is the critical distinction. Meaning belongs to interpretation. Living belongs to experience. When you are interpreting life, you're always slightly removed from it. You are asking what it signifies, what it leads to, what it proves. Meaning helps at that distance. But when distance collapses, meaning loses relevance. You are no longer standing outside your life, asking what it is for. You are inside it. And inside, the question does not arise. This sounds simple, but it feels unsettling, because you are taught that a life without meaning is empty. So when meaning-seeking ends, the mind rushes to fill the gap. It labels the experience. Nihilism, depression, burnout, spiritual disconnection. But none of these quite fit, because you are not rejecting life. You are not disengaged. You are not despairing. You are simply no longer framing your experience through purpose, and that is unfamiliar. This stage often follows the collapse of motivation very closely. Once you stop forcing yourself, you also stop asking why you should force yourself. The question dissolves, and with it, the whole structure of purpose-driven living begins to fade. This is why many people at this stage feel guilty. They think, other people are searching for meaning. Why am I not? Shouldn't I be more concerned about purpose? Am I wasting my life by not striving for something bigger? These thoughts come from social conditioning, from narratives that equate meaning with worth. But those narratives belong to a different psychological structure, one where identity needs reinforcement, one where suffering needs justification, one where effort must be explained. As that structure dissolves, meaning loses its function, and when something loses its function, it disappears quietly. This is not loss. It is obsolescence. But obsolescence feels like loss if you don't understand what replaced it. So the psyche hesitates. It looks around. It asks, what now? And the answer does not arrive as a concept. It arrives as ordinariness. You still wake up. You still eat. You still work, relate, respond. But you are not narrating your life to yourself. You are not placing it inside a larger story. You are not measuring each action against a sense of purpose. And because you are not doing that, life feels lighter, but also less important. And that is what triggers the fear. Because importance was once your anchor. If something mattered, it gave you a reason to endure. So when importance fades, the mind asks, what keeps me going now? This question assumes that something must keep you going, that life requires justification, that without a reason you will stop. But life does not need justification. It only needs to be lived. And this is the paradox of this stage. You are living more directly, but the mind interprets this as a loss of meaning, because the mind was the one asking for meaning, and now it is no longer in charge. This is deeply unsettling for the ego, because the ego organizes life through narrative, through explanation, through purpose. Without narrative, the ego feels displaced, and displacement feels like danger, so it raises alarms. It tells you something is wrong. It tells you should care more. It tells you should be searching. But notice something important. Even as these alarms arise, you do not rush to fix the problem. You do not immediately start reading about meaning. You do not panic and rebuild a philosophy. You hesitate. You sit with the unease. And that hesitation is new, because in the past, uncertainty would have triggered immediate action. You would have searched for answers, for frameworks, for explanations. Now you don't, not because you don't know how, but because the impulse is gone, and that absence is the real shift, the absence of seeking. This is why the stage feels so quiet. There is no drama, no breakdown, no revelation, just the slow fading of a question that once dominated your inner life. What is this all for? When that question fades, the mind interprets it as loss. But what is actually fading is a coping mechanism. Meaning was a way to manage uncertainty, a way to endure suffering, a way to organize identity. As identity loosens, meaning becomes unnecessary. This does not mean suffering disappears. It means suffering no longer needs explanation. And when suffering no longer needs explanation, meaning loses its grip. This is why people often misinterpret this stage as nihilism, because nihilism rejects meaning aggressively. This stage does not reject anything. It simply stops asking. And there's a profound difference between rejection and irrelevance. Rejection implies struggle. Irrelevance implies completion. The search for meaning ends not because you found the answer, but because the question no longer serves you. This is difficult to accept because it contradicts everything we are taught about growth. We are told that growth leads to higher meaning, deeper purpose, greater significance. But Jung saw something different. He saw that meaning is often a bridge, not a destination. It helps you cross difficult terrain. But once you cross, the bridge is no longer needed. You don't carry it with you. You leave it behind. And if you don't understand this, you may turn around and mourn the bridge, thinking you lost something essential, when in reality, you move beyond it. This first chapter is not about convincing you that losing the search for meaning is good. It is about accurately describing what is happening. Because if you misunderstand this stage, you will try to fix something that is not broken. You will try to reintroduce meaning artificially. You will rebuild narratives. You will impose purpose. And that will recreate the very tension that is just dissolved. For now, it is enough to notice this. You are no longer chasing meaning. And that does not mean you are lost. It means something fundamental has shifted in how you relate to life. In the next part of this exploration, we will look at why chasing meaning again recreates psychological pressure, and why meaning, when forced, becomes empty rather than fulfilling. For now, let the Once you notice that the search for meaning has faded, the next impulse is almost inevitable. You try to bring it back. Not aggressively, not desperately, quietly. You tell yourself that meaning is important, that a meaningful life is a responsible life, that without meaning, something essential must be missing. So you begin looking again. You reflect. You analyze. You ask yourself what your life is about. And almost immediately, something tightens. The calm you felt before becomes strained. The neutrality becomes restless. The quiet becomes heavy. You don't feel fulfilled by the search. You feel pressured by it. This is the first sign that something has changed. Earlier in life, searching for meaning felt necessary. It gave direction to suffering. It gave coherence to effort. It made difficulty tolerable. But now, when you search for meaning, it feels artificial, forced, like trying to revive a language you no longer think in. This discomfort is not random. It is structural, because meaning-seeking belongs to a psyche that is no longer in charge. And when an outdated structure tries to reassert itself, pressure appears. This is why chasing meaning again feels so different from before. It does not feel inspiring. It feels intrusive. You may notice thoughts like, I should know what my life is for. I should have a clearer purpose. I should be striving towards something meaningful. These thoughts carry a familiar tone, the tone of obligation. Meaning has quietly turned into a demand. And the moment meaning becomes a demand, it loses its vitality. It becomes a tool of control. Carl Jung warned that when meaning is imposed rather than lived, it becomes a burden, not because meaning is false, but because it is no longer organic. Meaning, when it arises naturally, accompanies experience. Meaning, when it is chased, replaces experience. And replacement creates tension. This is why the renewed search for meaning often feels hollow. You may read ideas, listen to perspectives, revisit philosophies that once moved you, and instead of resonance, you feel distance. Instead of clarity, you feel fatigue. This is not because those ideas are wrong. It is because they are no longer addressing the same psyche. They are speaking to a structure that is already dissolved. Earlier, meaning helped you hold life together. Now life is holding itself. And introducing meaning as an organizing principle disrupts that stability. This is a paradox. Meaning once stabilized you. Now it destabilizes you. Because meaning requires interpretation. And interpretation pulls you out of immediacy. It places you above your life, evaluating it, judging it, measuring it. This evaluative stance recreates pressure. You begin asking, is this meaningful enough? Is this aligned with my purpose? Is my life living up to something? These questions sound thoughtful, but they are not neutral. They impose standards. They reintroduce hierarchy. They create an internal judge. And that judge was precisely what dissolved in the previous stages. So when it returns, even subtly, the psyche resists. Not because it rejects meaning, but because it rejects surveillance. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They think they have lost depth. They think they have become superficial. They think life has become smaller. But what has actually happened is that life has stopped being mediated. You are no longer watching yourself live. You are living. Meaning seeking pulls you back into observation, back into narration, back into evaluation. And that feels exhausting now, because evaluation is work. It requires constant comparison between what is and what should be. Without evaluation, life feels simpler. With evaluation, tension returns. This is why chasing meaning recreates psychological pressure. Because meaning at this stage is no longer a response to life. It is a requirement imposed on it. And requirements always generate resistance. The psyche does not like being told what it should find meaningful, especially when it has already let go of that framework. This is why attempts to rediscover purpose often fail at this stage. They feel like regression, like stepping back into a smaller room. You may notice guilt arising here. Guilt for not caring enough. Guilt for not striving. Guilt for not having a mission. This guilt is not moral. It is residual conditioning. It comes from a worldview that equates worth with purpose, contribution with meaning, activity with value. But that worldview belongs to an earlier psychological phase, one where identity needed reinforcement, one where effort needed justification. As identity stabilizes, justification loses relevance. And without justification, meaning loses urgency. This does not mean life becomes random. It means life becomes less symbolic, less representative, less about standing for something, more about being something. This is difficult to articulate because language itself is symbolic. Meaning thrives in language. Living does not require commentary. So when you try to talk about this stage, it often sounds empty. People say things like, "I don't know. I just live my life now." And this sounds shallow to those still seeking meaning. But internally, it is not shallow. It is grounded. The problem is that grounding does not translate into philosophy easily. It translates into ordinariness. And ordinariness is easily dismissed. But ordinariness is not emptiness. It is the absence of inflation. Chasing meaning again often leads to inflation. You try to elevate your life conceptually, to place it inside a larger story, to give it significance. But significance is an ego concern. It answers a question, how important am I? Or, how important is my life? When ego loosens, that question loses relevance. And when it loses relevance, attempts to revive it feel forced. This is why meaning-seeking at this stage feels like self-coercion. It tries to manufacture importance where importance is no longer needed. Life does not need to feel important to be lived fully. It needs to be engaged. This is a distinction most people miss. Engagement replaces meaning, not excitement, not passion. Engagement. Engagement is contact without commentary. You are present with what you're doing, not because it symbolizes something, but because it is what is happening. Meaning adds a layer on top of experience. Engagement removes layers. So when you chase meaning, you reintroduce layers. And layers create distance. Distance creates dissatisfaction, which you then try to solve by finding more meaning. This creates a loop of searching that never satisfies. Because the satisfaction you're looking for is not conceptual. It is experiential. And no concept can replace experience. This is why Jung emphasized that individuation ultimately leads away from abstraction, not toward it. He saw that in the later stages of development, people become less interested in explaining life and more interested in living it, less interested in significance, more interested in reality. But reality, without symbolic framing, feels small at first, because we are taught to equate size with value, big meanings, big purposes, big narratives. Without those, life feels reduced. But what is actually reduced is noise, not substance. This is where patience is required, because the temptation to rebuild meaning is strong, especially when others question you. They may ask, what's driving you now? What do you want your life to be about? Don't you care about purpose anymore? And these questions can destabilize you, because they mirror your own doubts. They reflect social expectations. And part of you still wants to answer, still wants to reassure, still wants to say something that makes sense. But the truth is quieter and harder to explain. You are no longer driven by meaning. You are guided by presence. Presence does not translate into a mission statement. It does not produce a slogan. It does not fit neatly into narratives. So when you try to articulate it, it sounds incomplete, and incompleteness is uncomfortable, especially in a world that values clarity. But clarity does not always mean explanation. Sometimes clarity means acceptance. Acceptance that this phase does not offer a story. It offers a way of being. This is why the renewed search for meaning often feels like betrayal, not of ideals, of yourself. You feel yourself pulling away from something stable, back into striving, back into tension, and part of you resists. That resistance is important. It is the same resistance you felt when forcing motivation, the same resistance you felt when trying to explain yourself again. It is the psyche saying, this no longer fits. Meaning has become another form of pressure, another way of telling yourself what your life should be. And at this stage, should is no longer the organizing principle. Life organizes itself through contact, through response, through presence. This is not glamorous. It does not sell well. It does not inspire grand speeches, but it is stable, and stability is what the psyche is moving toward. This second chapter is not about rejecting meaning. It is about understanding why meaning no longer functions the way it used to, why chasing it creates pressure rather than fulfillment, and why the discomfort you feel when you try to search again is not a failure. It is a signal that life is asking to be lived directly, not interpreted. In the final part of this exploration, we will look at what remains when the search for meaning fully dissolves, what kind of meaning exists without being pursued, how life organizes itself without a narrative, and why this stage is not emptiness, but quiet coherence. For now, notice the pressure that returns when you try to make life meaningful again. Notice how quickly tension replaces ease. And consider the possibility that meaning at this stage is not something to be found, but something that no longer needs to be sought. If you allow the search for meaning to fade without trying to replace it, something unexpected begins to happen. Not immediately, not dramatically. At first, there is simply space. Space where questions used to be. Space where interpretation once lived. Space where effort was once justified by purpose. This space can feel uncomfortable because the mind is conditioned to fill it, to explain, to define, to assign significance. But if you resist the urge to fill it, the space does not remain empty. It settles. And what settles into that space is not meaning in the old sense. It is something quieter, lived coherence. You begin to notice that life continues without commentary. You wake up. You respond. You engage with what is in front of you, not because it means something, but because it is there. This is the shift that is hardest to trust, because it does not come with emotional intensity. There is no feeling of revelation, no sense of arrival, no inner voice declaring that you have found something profound. Instead, there's reduction, less inner noise, less questioning, less narrative, and that reduction can feel anticlimactic, especially if you were taught that depth should feel dramatic. But depth does not always announce itself. Sometimes it appears as simplicity. This is where the misunderstanding about meaning becomes clear. Meaning was never meant to be chased indefinitely. It was meant to carry you through a phase, to help you endure uncertainty, to give shape to experience when identity was still forming. Once identity stabilizes, meaning becomes redundant, not false, redundant. And redundancy does not collapse violently. It fades, quietly. You may notice that you no longer feel compelled to interpret your life. You do not ask what your experiences symbolize. You do not measure moments against a larger narrative. You are not trying to turn life into a story. You are living it. This does not feel profound. It feels ordinary. And ordinariness is often mistaken for emptiness. But ordinariness is not emptiness. It is life without inflation. Inflation is what meaning often produces. A sense that something must be important, that something must signify, that something must justify itself. Without inflation, life feels smaller, but also lighter. And lighter does not mean less alive. It means less burdened. Carl Jung believed that in the later stages of individuation, the individual becomes less interested in meaning and more interested in reality. Not reality as an abstract concept, reality as it is lived. He observed that people who had gone far enough inward stopped asking metaphysical questions, not but because the questions no longer served a function. They were no longer necessary for orientation. This is what you are experiencing. Orientation without explanation. You know where you are without needing to define it. You know what matters without articulating why. This does not mean values disappear. It means values are no longer defended. They are embodied. Embodied values do not announce themselves. They guide behavior quietly. You may notice that your actions feel simpler now. You do what needs to be done. You stop doing what does not because it fits a purpose, but because it fits reality. Reality as a way of organizing behavior, without narrative. If you are hungry, you eat. If something requires attention, you respond. If something no longer belongs, you let it go. There is no existential commentary attached, and this absence of commentary can feel unsettling if you were used to living through interpretation. But interpretation was a layer, not the substance. Now that the layer has dissolved, you are closer to the substance. And substance does not need meaning. It needs presence. This is where lived meaning quietly replaces conceptual meaning. Lived meaning is not something you think about. It is something you experience indirectly. You notice it afterward, in the absence of conflict, in the ease of action, in the lack of internal debate. You do not wake up feeling that your life is meaningful. You wake up and live. And later, if someone asks you whether your life has meaning, the question feels slightly misplaced. Not offensive, just irrelevant. Because meaning is no longer something you relate to consciously. It is not missing. It is implicit. This is a difficult thing to explain to someone who is still searching, because searchers need answers. And you no longer have answers. Not because you are confused, but because you are not asking questions. This can create distance. Others may want you to articulate what your life is about. They may want to locate you inside a narrative, and you may struggle to do so, not because you are lost, but because the narrative has dissolved, and trying to rebuild it feels false. This is where many people fear that they are becoming empty, but emptiness implies lack. This is not lack. It is fullness without labeling. A glass does not need to be labeled full to hold water. Life does not need to be labeled meaningful to be lived. The problem is that language struggles here, because language is built to describe concepts, and this stage is post-conceptual. So when you try to talk about it, it sounds vague, unimpressive, almost disappointing, and that can trigger doubt. You may wonder if you have settled for less, if you have given up something important, if you should push yourself to care more, to strive more, to search again. But when you imagine returning to the search, your body resists, not dramatically, quietly, because the search would reintroduce tension. It would pull you out of contact with life and back into evaluation, and that no longer fits. This is a clearest sign that the search is truly over, not because you decided it was, but because your psyche will not cooperate with it anymore, just as it no longer cooperated with forced motivation, just as it no longer cooperated with constant explanation, meaning seeking belonged to a phase where identity was externalized. Now identity is internalized, and internalized identity does not require justification. It does not need to know what it stands for. It stands. This is why this stage often feels quieter socially. You may speak less about your life, not because you are secretive, but because there is less to narrate. You may find yourself less interested in debates about purpose, direction, or significance, not because you dismiss them, but because they do not move you. They feel theoretical, and you are living practically. This does not make you shallow. It makes you grounded. Grounded people are often misunderstood because they do not perform depth. They embody it, and embodiment is subtle. It does not sparkle. It does not persuade. It simply functions. This is the paradox of lived meaning. From the inside, it feels like nothing special. From the outside, it can look like stability, consistency, reliability. You are no longer searching for something to give your life meaning. Your life expresses meaning through how it is lived, through attention, through restraint, through presence. And presence does not feel important. It feels sufficient. This sufficiency is what replaces a hunger for meaning. You are no longer hungry for explanation. You are nourished by contact. This does not mean suffering disappears. Pain still happens. Loss still happens. Uncertainty still happens. But suffering no longer demands interpretation. You do not ask what it means. You respond to it. You grieve when there is loss. You adjust when there is change. You endure when endurance is required, without turning these experiences into symbols, without extracting lessons, without forcing narratives. This is where life becomes more humane, less instructional, less moralized, more direct. Jung believed that this was the quiet goal of individuation, not enlightenment, not transcendence, but the ability to live without constantly asking why, the ability to be in life without standing outside of it. This is not regression. It is arrival, but arrival without ceremony, which is why it is so easy to miss. You might be tempted to think that something more should have happened, that there should be a feeling of completion. But completion does not feel like a climax. It feels like things no longer needing to be resolved. You stop asking whether your life has meaning, and you realize much later that the question itself was attention. Without the question, life does not need to justify itself, and that is the quiet freedom of this stage. The search for meaning ends not because you found the answer, but because the question is no longer necessary. Meaning was a bridge, not a destination. Once you cross, you do not carry it with you. What remains is not emptiness. It is lived coherence. Life no longer needs to explain itself to be valid. You no longer need to locate purpose to act. You respond to what is real, and that response, over time, becomes its own meaning, not spoken, not conceptual, lived. If this reflection put words to something you've been experiencing, consider staying with this exploration. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring these later stages of psychological development through the lens of Carl Jung. And if you know someone who feels unsettled because the search for meaning has quietly ended, share this with them. Some phases don't need answers. They need recognition.